We've been taught by the war on drugs that drug users are bad. They must go to jail. And to really deliver care to these people who are suffering, we had to kind of put that war on drug mentality aside. And even for me, I certainly had some biases of my own that I had to unravel as I've been, been working on this topic now for 10 years. But you don't recognize your own blind spots, right?
Hi, I'm Derik Mills. Welcome to the Glow Podcast. Beth Macy is a journalist who has written with great compassion about the opioid crisis in America. Addiction can be a difficult process for so many reasons, in part because we can often approach it with bias. Beth was moved by the addiction stories that she uncovered, and eventually she wrote a bestseller about the opioid epidemic called Dopesick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America. The book has been adapted into a series for Hulu starring Rosario Dawson and Michael Keaton. As my wife and I watched it, we often shed tears because it was heartbreaking to see how it revealed that innocent people wanting to treat their pain didn't know they could likely become addicted to their medication, which in this case is OxyContin. We talk about Beth's compassionate writing process, and she shares stories of filming the series, including her appearance in the show. Here's my conversation with Beth Macy, author of Dopesick. If you or someone you know are suffering from addiction, please see in our show notes where we post some links to helpful resources. Hi, Beth. It's great to be back with you again.
It's great to be here.
I am remembering with a smile when our producer reached out to you that it was so fun to see your response that you're a huge Glow fan. I did not know that. Huge. Almost every day Glow fan with my BFF, Martha Biebinger. And we do yoga together almost every morning. That's so cool. Do you use the practice with a friend feature?
Yes. And she turned me onto it, but we have some favorites. We love Gustavo and Elena and Joe, and we think she's in Australia. We have certain ones for whatever body part is ailing us, and it's been really great. Not just the yoga, which is fantastic, but also just the daily fellowship. The check-in, and because she lives in Boston, and I live in Virginia, so it's been really cool.
That's amazing. We love hearing stories like that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I want to turn to your newest book, Dopesick. It's the title is Dopesick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America, and the show about it on Hulu. And I hope in our conversation to make the case for why people should read your book and watch the show, which, by the way, are both captivating and heartbreaking. And part of what your work has done for me is to destigmatize opioid addiction. You've expanded my awareness on how incredibly easy it seems to inadvertently become addicted or die from these drugs, and how difficult it is to treat the addiction. And I also knew very little about fentanyl, and nor did I know anything about the companies that produced and distribute OxyContin, and how they misled and lied to their sales teams, doctors, the FDA, the public, about how addictive this drug is. And so I'm curious if we start off with you sharing with us a bit of your background and how you came to report on and write about this topic.
Sure. So I was a longtime newspaper reporter here in Roanoke, Virginia. I worked at the Roanoke Times for 25 years. And one of the last series projects I did was in 2012. And it was when heroin first sort of bubbled up as a problem, and it wasn't in the inner city, which or stereotypically marginalized community that I normally reported on. It was actually in the wealthiest suburb. And I did this 3-part series on how heroin had upended the lives of these 2 young men who had been private school classmates. One died from heroin overdose, and the other was about to go to prison for 5 years for his role in selling him the heroin. And so I did this 3-part series. Readers literally like spit up their coffee and went, "What? Wealthy white kids are doing heroin?" We had no idea. And of course, I didn't really know either because it wasn't something that made the news a lot then. And what I came to learn later, a couple years later, when I was casting about for an idea for my second book, was that the heroin epidemic that I started reporting it in the late aughts, early teens, was very much a continuation of the OxyContin and opioid pill painkiller epidemic that began in the late 90s with the introduction of OxyContin and this notion that Purdue paid for among our healthcare providers and paid for lobbying, and to basically change the narrative among healthcare providers that whereas they knew for a century that opioids should only be used post-surgery, not for very long, cancer, end of life. Now they were saying opioids, and namely their drug OxyContin, was safe for all manner of, what you and I would consider kind of minor things. Like it's not minor when you have backache, but it's not safe for moderate backache to go to OxyContin first thing. But they changed the narrative. And the way they did it was they targeted these poor, distressed communities where the jobs were going away and where they had high incidence of workplace injuries. And they sent their doctors out to say that OxyContin is safer than competing opioids. It was also way stronger than competing opioids. And when doctors raise concerns, they're like, "Oh, no, it's fine. The FDA allows us to say it's safer." And the FDA did. And the story about how that came to be is something that the Hulu show, I think, unravels really well. But when I first started writing about heroin in 2012, I didn't realize how connected it was to the pills. Now, I ran into the kid recently. He came to the Dopesick premiere here in Roanoke, the first person who ever taught me the word Dopesick. And he's doing well now after his prison stint. I mean, well, he has PTSD from having been in prison, and but he's doing well, all things considered. And he just reminded me of those early days and how he actually was the one who taught me. He said, if you're addicted to heroin and you know that your dealer isn't going to be available to you for 4 or 5 days and you just have X amount left, you're going to parse that out so you don't end up in withdrawal. And the word he used was Dopesick, which is like this excruciating pain that people go through. And so, which is why I really appreciate you starting off by saying the show and the book destigmatize it, because many people at the end of their journey, they're not taking these opioid drugs to get high. They're doing it so as not to be dopesick.
I didn't know what dopesick meant prior to reading your book and watching the show. And I wonder if at this point it'd be helpful for you to share some statistics that give us a sense of the scale of what we're dealing with here. For example, number of deaths or number of pills produced, the crime. Also,
Sure.
you give us some projections in terms of how opioids are on pace to kill a certain number of Americans over the next 10 years.
Yeah. And actually, the numbers are a lot worse than they were when Dopesick first came out. Back then, the stat of the day was we have lost 300,000 Americans to drug overdose in the past 15 years. We're on track to lose that many more in just the next 5. So it was an upward curve, right? And when I checked back with the professor scholar who gave me those numbers, and he's been plotting out drug overdose deaths going back to 1979. It is an exponential curve. And when I said, well, how many deaths have we lost since 1999? Since 1996, the year OxyContin came out. And he sent me the CDC charts, and I added them up. There had been a lot of news around the fact that during COVID, America lost more than 100,000 people. That just came out maybe 3 months ago.
Right.
But nobody had put together. They always go back to 1999. I said, let's go back to 1996 when OxyContin first kind of revolutionized the way these drugs were being prescribed. And when you added all the numbers up, we've actually lost over 1 million people. since 1996 to drug overdoses, not just opioids, but mostly to opioids, 2/3 to 3/4 to opioids. And when I asked that scholar, when did he predict that those numbers would double again, get to 2 million? It was by 2029. So that's just 7 years from now. And so you see, it really is an exponential curve. And of course, that's not counting all the deaths from addiction-related illness like endocarditis or hepatitis C or HIV. And it's not counting all the friends and family members that are grieving still the loss of these people. More than or roughly a third of Americans have had opioid use disorder be a serious problem in their family. That was a Gallup poll that came out a couple months back. And, a third, and I dare say there's almost no one who doesn't at least know somebody who's been impacted by it.
Right. In the show and in your book, you go into the detail of how Purdue went about this, what seemed to be an organized strategy for presenting this medication in a way that was misleading. And I want to come back to that, but I wonder if we spend a little bit more time on the experience of the addiction and how hard it is to treat the addiction. For example, I didn't realize that it took so long to recover. I didn't realize that it had such a damaging effect on certain parts of the brain, and also that the treatment for opioid use disorder is quite counterintuitive.
So we have a treatment gap in our country of about 88%, and it's just very slowly getting better. When I say 88%, that means that 12% of people with substance use disorders have been able to get treatment in the past year. Just 12%. I mean, that's astonishingly low in a first world country. And part of the reason that is because there remains stigma around both OUD or opioid use disorder, as well as the gold standard treatments for them. The gold standards of care for OUD are buprenorphine and methadone. These are weaker opioids themselves. So there is this notion floating around that it's just treating an addiction with another drug. And it's really not true, because at this point, when somebody has been using opioids for a while, the brain gets acculturated to it. It almost hijacked is a word that comes up a lot. So such that their body stops producing natural opioids. And if they don't get external opioids, they feel just a terrible, terrible craving. And then this physical and psychological anxiety, depression, nausea, diarrhea, restless leg. I mean, that's dope sickness in a nutshell. And we know that when people use these medication-assisted treatments, buprenorphine or methadone, we know that they are at least 60% more likely not to die, and that they have, a much better chance of, getting jobs, getting their families back, getting their life on track. And very, very slowly, they can wean off the medicine if they and their healthcare provider thinks that's the way to go. But a lot of experts think it's not unlike a diabetic having to take insulin for the rest of their lives. Like, their brain has been changed. So there's still a lot of research to be done on that. But the evidence is really clear. And where I see people falling through the cracks, the young woman I write about the most in Dopesick is a young woman named Tess Henry, who every time she had access to her MAT would be doing okay. And then when she would lose it, or she wouldn't be able to get in with another provider because of long waiting lists, that's when she really fell through the cracks. And, ultimately she doesn't make it in the book, which is just horrifically sad. And this is a person who you would think would have every opportunity to get treatment because her dad was a physician, her mom works at a hospital, and she didn't. And a lot of the reason she didn't was because of the stigmatization of these medicines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the performance by Michael Keaton in terms of him conveying and coming to the realization that he may be on these medications for the rest of his life, and his whole journey, watching him agonize over whether or not to prescribe, and then ultimately how we see him navigate his own addiction.
Yeah, isn't he good?
So good.
He's so good.
And then
I could watch him over and over. And just, that was really, really important to me. Like, Hollywood comes calling. We want to turn your book into a series. Great, great, absolutely great. But the two things I really wanted going into it was I wanted just what you said. I wanted to destigmatize people with opioid use disorder. So when you see Michael Keaton being stigmatized initially for getting on methadone, or you see Betsy not being, being stigmatized in her AA meetings for even considering it, I think we really showed how that breaks down too often in America. And the other thing was I didn't want us to stereotype Appalachia, and I don't think we did. It's rare as the movie that or show that ventures into the lives of poor people and Appalachians and doesn't resort to stereotypes. So I'm really proud of the way the show came out with that regard too.
And you mentioned Betsy. How do you pronounce her last name? Malum?
Malum.
Betsy Malum as Kaitlyn Dever. Is it Dever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Incredible as well.
Oh, yeah. She's really incredible. They called her Little Meryl for Meryl Streep on the set. And she was so into getting the dope sickness in particular exactly right that she made like a spreadsheet of all the different characteristics. And I just love that combination of being really creative and yet just really doing her homework. And apparently there was somebody in the crew who was in recovery from OUD, and she really leaned on him a lot too, which, that was really cool to see.
It definitely comes across, and seeing the two of them interact and navigate their own mutual shame around this. And I think in terms of destigmatizing, mission certainly accomplished.
Oh, thank you.
I also want to mention Rosario Dawson and her performance, equally incredible.
Absolutely. And through her character, she plays this DEA agent who, is just a total badass, right?
Yeah.
Like she's tough and she turns a lot of people off because she's so tough. But you also see that everybody has their pain in this story, and she has to work so hard at trying to hold this company to account that she experiences her own pain because of it in her own relationship. So I think that's really powerful.
And you have an appearance on the show in episode 3. What was that like?
Well, that was interesting. I'm really glad I did it because that was the only way I got on set, because the COVID restrictions were so serious. You had to go 4 days early and get tested every day before you could be where the actors were, because they didn't want to have to shut down the filming because of COVID. And so because I had this little tiny role that, by the way, I did have to audition for, I'm sure I got a pass because I was the author of the book, but I was able to, really see that how they shoot every scene 20 times and from different angles and then splice it all together, which of course makes sense. But, it was really, when my little scene, I'm in this community meeting and there's 30 extras in the audience of this meeting in which I'm on a panel, and then at least that many more people standing behind them on the crew. And, it's just a huge production. I mean, I just was there for that one little scene, but hats off to Hulu for really doing a first-class job at such a big production. There's 5 different storylines. And it wasn't a cheap show to produce. And, and we had to have all of our I's dotted and our T's crossed legally too. So it was a big effort. The showrunner, Danny Strong, is amazing. He had done Game Change, Recount, The Butler. So he had experience. He really knew how to take a fiction book or story and bring it to life within the context of a docuseries. So I'm really, really lucky that my first project was with him, because he's just fun to work with, really serious, works very, very hard, and was able to just wrangle all these different storylines, all these different people in a way that I think everybody ultimately was just so proud of how it came out.
Yeah, you mentioned kudos to Hulu. I can imagine the legal consideration that would have been part of this process.
Absolutely.
There are other shows who cover or navigate this crisis in their storyline narratives that don't actually name the company and the family.
Yeah. Well, as we were working on the show, more documentation was coming out like every week. People leaked us documents, new lawsuits were filed. Massachusetts actually named the Sacklers in their suits. They were the first state to name the Sacklers. And in their legal filing, which was, many, many pages long, there was a lot of new information to us. A book came out like right before we were done shooting called Empire of Pain that had some new information in it. We were able to include some of that in the story. Like literally Danny was writing one scene right before they shot it the next day. And it was a scene that we had previously had, but it was a second source, and it allowed us, the lawyers were nervous about one source, but then we had two. And so that he was able to put that scene back in. So, we interviewed a lot of people that had worked for the company. Together, we would get on the phone, conference in a person. We brought Dr. Steve Lloyd, who is a doctor, very much like the Keaton character. He's a Tennessee doctor. We brought him into the writing room in 2020. We were all working virtually via Zoom. After COVID hit, we all just kind of went back to our corners, and we brought Dr. Steve in one day just to tell us everything from the horrors of being dope sick to being shopped by patients to being, told lies by reps to being in rehabs. And now he's an addiction doctor himself. And I think when we interviewed him on Zoom, you could see the clinic he runs and the logo behind him. And it's almost exactly parallel to where Michael Keaton ends up at the end of his journey. So that was really neat to watch unfold too.
What was that like to see your writing turned into a show?
Well, it was super exciting. I mean, mainly because of those two things: the fact that we didn't stereotype Appalachia, the fact that we didn't hammer the abusers, as Richard Sackler has, often told people to do. We made them human beings, many of whom were initially addicted through no fault of their own. And, we showed just the insidious nature of opioids, and when they, run smack into greed and a lack of a regulatory system. And to see this story that had been slow simmering for 25 years, to see it compressed into 8 hours of television in a way that makes it not just entertaining and moving, but also really understandable. I think there's so many articles, hundreds of articles about the lawsuits, about the overdose crisis, about fentanyl, but our show really makes it understandable for the average reader. And I think once you've seen it, you go, oh, this is how it started. Mm-hmm. So not only do you get it, but then also you can have empathy, one hopes, for all the folks that got ensnared in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my wife and I can't count the number of times we shed tears watching that. So heartbreaking to see, like I said at the beginning, innocent, lovely people wanting to treat their pain, but not knowing that they would end up becoming addicted to this medication.
Absolutely.
I want to go into, like I said, I want to go back to Purdue and some of the ways in which this came about. One last question in terms of turning your writing into a show. I can imagine that the decision-making process of what to leave out must be a struggle, if not painful. Like, was there anything that's in your book that you really wanted in the show? There's so much that you cover in your book that you don't cover in the show.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the show really tracks with part one of the book, the first third. So the second third and the third third barely get covered, except for you have these characters in the early OxyContin story that run into the same snags that Tess Henry does in the book, later in the book. So so that was really, like, that was very informing of the story. Danny wanted to tell the story of the early crisis, right? It mostly ends in 2007 with the guilty plea by Purdue, not any Sacklers, just 3 executives who were, quote, thrown under the bus, right, by the Sacklers. And, kind of a smack on the wrist for a company that had made billions off this drug. And then afterwards, just turbocharges sales and goes right on. And, we wanted to show that, but we mainly wanted the story to end in 2007. And Dopesick, the book, goes right up to early 2018. But there's a lot of stuff that happens in the interim that, because I had this experience of reporting, we were able to fold into the earlier story in a way that isn't, out of line or incorrect. We also had a member of the writing team who is in recovery himself and had spent a year going to a methadone clinic in New York City, not in, Appalachia, but his experience tracked really well and brought a lot to the conversations too.
Mm. So you had mentioned earlier the lies by the reps. You referred to one of the doctors. Can you share with us how Purdue went about convincing the FDA to create this label that allowed for this drug to exist? Some of the ways that they changed the axis of certain charts to make it seem as though this medication is less addictive than it is. We could spend a whole hour just probably on this section. I mean, they came up with
the show is actually, even though it's a docudrama, it is spot on with exactly what happened, down to Curtis Wright, who was the FDA medical review officer who approved OxyContin. We dramatized that in the show, but that's all from like that leaked memo that I mentioned. It's all from interviews. What they did basically was they had lobbyists. There's a quote from Richard in one of the lawsuits about, we can get every congressperson or senator on the phone in 10 minutes if we want to, or something to that effect. And what they did is they bought influence. So once they get this label, which becomes their primary selling tool, that's a quote from somebody at Purdue. This label is our primary selling tool. A label like that had never been allowed before. And then you have 18 months after it's approved, the guy who approves it goes to work for Purdue Pharma, like tripling his government salary. And that's when you hear about the revolving door, that's what that is. We shouldn't allow people our regulators being soft on industry because they're thinking about what their retirement job's going to be. I mean, that's just wrong. Mm-hmm. And, when we got this memo that showed how Curtis Wright and some members of Purdue not only were like talking about how to, make this drug super profitable, they rented a hotel suite off-site down the road from the FDA and literally wrote some of the documentation together. And it's just so wrong when you look at it. And one of the things that we're like, well, how does that happen? Well, it happens because going back to Ronald Reagan and deregulation, and suddenly the FDA is largely, the regulatory budget comes from industry. So, that's another loophole we need to fix. And so we were just really hoping to show how that happens, how it is that once they get that golden ticket, that label, then they've got to convince doctors. They paid 5,000 doctors, nurses, pharmacists to go on these swanky vacations where they would learn more about OxyContin and become paid speakers for the company, just like you see Dr. Phoenix, the Michael Keaton character, doing. And that's all from the records and the archives. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, down to the stuffed gorilla and the OxyContin branded beach hat that you see him carrying at the end of one of the episodes. It's all stuff they did. And it's when you lay it all out there in 8 hours, it's really stunning.
It's just so shocking. In your book, you provide a pretty lengthy history of humans and our relationship to opioids and the addictions that can easily ensue. And throughout these, while reading your book and watching the show, I'm constantly thinking, how we should have known better. How does something like this slip through? And part of what you just shared explains it. But also, they were very savvy along the way with redefining pain, the concept of doubling the dose, the concept of breakthrough pain, pseudo addiction. It seemed like an endless onslaught of really clever and marketing.
Yeah. And which all goes back to Arthur Sackler, who had nothing to do with OxyContin because he was dead before they came out with it. But, he made Valium the nation's first billion-dollar drug. He was a marketer. And then his, descendants or his relatives took that and, made it even bigger. And when you see that playing out, you see the Billy character, the sales rep, Michael Keaton slowly realizes he's been duped and he gets really, really angry. That happened right and left. And it was to a point where, like, I have a lot of friends who are doctors or nurses. They all have a story. I went to the ER with a friend not long ago. Her husband was ill. There's that pain chart with the smiley faces. I mean, it's all around. It was so well saturated. And part of the reason that they were able to do it is they co-opted the pain societies and the pain orgs. And they funded them. They funded some of the best names in pain medicine. Russell Portnoy, you see, he later recants, we went too far. He tells the Wall Street Journal in 2012. But in our show, as we portray it, they basically paid him to, he's Ivy League and other people at great institutions. I mean, just think of everything you can think of with the Sackler name on it, from medical schools to the Met to Tufts University. They bought influence and they were very clever about it.
Yeah, that was very painful to watch. And to also see the dynamic between Richard and his father and the struggle that he was going through, to think that had there potentially been a better father-son relationship, so much pain could have been averted in our country.
Yeah. The book Empire of Pain goes into more detail on the family side of that. We weren't able to interview any members of the Sackler family. We tried, but they were not responsive. But there's been some great reporting on that. And certainly I all along have been more interested in kind of what happened as a result. How are the victims being treated now? How are these communities where it first bubbled up as a problem, these rural outlying communities that most people have no idea about. And that's where you see so much division, so much political division now. And there's so much anger in those communities. And a lot of it goes back to factories closing and jobs going away and coal mines shutting down. But a lot of those communities, had the twin aspect of really being hit hard by drug makers and distributors, Purdue, and many other companies as well. But they sort of led the charge. And I think
they targeted them.
Absolutely, because of the workplace injuries that they had higher incidences of. Just very cunning. And I think it's going to be generations before any of these communities are able to really fully recover from it.
Yeah, you certainly convey that. How has immersing yourself in this crisis and spending time with people and their stories affected you personally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I finished Dopesick, the book, I'm like, I never want to write about this again, ever. It was so dark. The main person I had spent the most time with, her and her mother, she was murdered on Christmas Eve. Her body found at the bottom of a dumpster.
So sad.
So sad. I just couldn't imagine a darker ending for a book, and yet, the sadness I felt was nothing like what these thousands of families have felt. And but as I went around the country talking about the book for 2 years, I started hearing stories of really cool people who were working on solutions, and I was like, I'm not putting this story down yet. Whoop. Get me rewrite. I want to do it. I'm not, I thought I was done with this topic, but I'm not. And so I just finished on Friday. I turned in my last edit for my new book, which is called Raising Lazarus, Hope, Justice, and the Future of America's Overdose Crisis. And it's largely a story of people who aren't waiting around for the government to solve it. They aren't waiting around for the lawsuit money to trickle in. They're going to the addicted where they are, people who use drugs, and they're embodying this concept of harm reduction, which means helping people use more safely, helping people get connected to treatment if that's what they want, giving them clean needles and safer ways to use. And there's some really amazing people doing that work right now in various places of the country. Of course, I'm doing most of my reporting in rural America and in Appalachia. So, I mean, those places are less culturally inclined to accept things like harm reduction. So, but I've found some people who are figuring ways around that, or figuring out how to change hearts and minds in some of these rural, very conservative areas. And so that to me is the answer. Like, we know what works. We know that harm reduction works. We know that MAT, the buprenorphine and the methadone work. We know that people need help with housing, and homelessness, and trauma-informed care. We've got a huge mental illness crisis in this country. We know these things work. We're just not doing them at a scale that matches the scale of the crisis. So that's what the new book is about. But it's definitely just like Dopesick Part 2.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you about the new book. When do you expect it will come out?
It's on schedule to publish August 16th of this year.
Oh, it's fast.
Yeah. And it also tells the behind the scenes story of some activists who are trying to make sure that the victims' voices get heard in the Purdue bankruptcy. And to some extent in some of the other opioid litigation. But it was just, especially when COVID hit, all the court hearings went online. If you were a victim, you rarely got your voice heard in this. And so I followed the travails of Nan Goldman, the artist who, finally succeeded just a few weeks ago in getting the Sackler name removed from the Met. A lawyer named Mike Quinn, he's the only pro bono lawyer working on this case, and is filing objections right and left on behalf of a small victim group called the Ad Hoc Committee on Accountability. And to me, it's a really interesting story because Mike has the whole system figured out, and he's going to make noise, and he's going to keep taking swipes until something happens. And so, I'm fighting from the victims, but from different angles, whether it's somebody doing harm reduction in the McDonald's parking lot, or it's, somebody starting a drug users union in West Virginia, which good Lord, who would have ever thought that was possible? To, this lawyer that I mentioned um, who has made a huge difference in the outcome of the Purdue bankruptcy.
And it's so helpful to hear these stories. You're giving voice to these stories and providing a platform for what people are experiencing to be told, which I found incredibly helpful in terms of, like I said earlier, the destigmatizing of this particular crisis.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's a hard story to untangle, and it could be told so many different ways. But I'm 57. I've been a journalist since the day I graduated from college, and uh, what I realized, it took me a decade or two, that I do the best storytelling when I pick the stories that move me,
Mm.
and I work really hard to put those into context with what's happening on the ground. And so I think, again, this new book, Raising Lazarus, is another way of sort of raising the flag and saying, hey, it's only gotten worse during COVID. And justice isn't easy. It's taking a lot of these people doing a lot of work to make sure their voices are heard, and a lot of people, working night and day to help the people that nobody wants to see. These people are largely unseen. Many of them are homeless, living in tents. They're really doing this hard, gritty work of meeting people where they are and trying to bring them into systems of care. And I find it really moving.
And that seems to be a thread for you. I haven't read True Vine and Factory Man, your two previous books, but after reading their short summaries, I want to. But that seems to be you find what pulls on your heart, and you follow that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's really accurate. I just realize I do a better job when it's something I really care about. So, that thing where I've learned to pay attention to things that make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. The new book begins literally in a McDonald's parking lot next to a dumpster. And this nurse practitioner who's worked all day treating the addicted, he's meeting somebody to give him clean needles and to get him on buprenorphine. And the guy says, look, if I don't get on this medicine, I'm going to die. I've got to get off the needle or I'm going to die. And Tim, the nurse practitioner, says two things. One, you can get better. People do get better all the time. You usually only hear about the deaths, but it's possible. Like, don't give up hope. And two, the key to that is don't disappear. So if you relapse in the next week, still come back to our appointment next week. And it's this idea of enveloping folks who have been made to feel like crap. Our system treats people with addiction like crap. They don't want them in their office. They don't want them in their parking lot. But they're actually amazing people, many of whom, as I said before, were initially addicted through no fault of their own. And don't we, as fellow humans, deserve to treat them as people with medical conditions that are worthy of care? And don't doctors who helped, I used to get really worked up about this. The first time I ever spoke to a group of doctors, I was like, any of y'all who ever took a free item from a pharmaceutical company should be, ethically bound to become part of the solution, right? Mm-hmm. Like they make doctors get waivered and do this training to prescribe buprenorphine, even though they don't have to have special training to prescribe opioids. And I was trying to guilt them into doing it. I don't know that was the best strategy. Although the ER where I was speaking at the time eventually did get all their doctors waivered, and they're so proud of the results. But there is this real kind of knee jerk, like, we don't want those people in our clinic. We don't want those people. They're bad people. And we all are sort of acculturated that way because we've been taught by the war on drugs that drug users are bad. They must go to jail, and to really deliver care to these people who are suffering, we had to kind of put that war on drug mentality aside. And to the point of, even for me, I certainly had some biases of my own that I had to unravel as I've been working on this topic now for 10 years. But you don't recognize your own blind spots, right? So if it's hard for me and I work in this area or have for 10 years, like it's going to be hard for the average reader too. So which is why in the new book especially I really try to go back in history to the war on drugs and back to the Harrison Narcotics Act, which outlawed heroin in 1914, and how political leaders have used racism as a way to sort of stoke the flames of this idea that the drug users should be incarcerated rather than given medical attention. But it's a tricky web of threads to unravel because, as I said, we don't realize that we all have biases. But, other countries deal with the drug crisis much differently and have much better results. They also are much better at regulating drugs before they come to the market because they haven't let industry take over the regulatory systems.
And spending time with your work was also an opportunity for me to challenge my biases. I'm 48. I was raised on in the time of Reagan, and this is your brain on drugs. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I want to admit that I went into watching the show, reading your book with a different attitude and appreciation for all of this. And yeah, I really hope that through the work that you're doing and by more and more people spending time with this material and understanding it and unpacking it, that some of the services you mentioned earlier become more readily available.
Yeah. And some of these people are so cool. Some of the people doing this work, like the nurse practitioner I mentioned. There's a young woman in Northern Virginia outside of DC who lost her brother because she didn't have Narcan when he OD'd. And she was like 22 at the time. And so she's gotten laws changed in Virginia to make Narcan more accessible. She now runs a mobile needle exchange clinic. She sends people into jails, which didn't want anything to do with treatment. Now they're doing MAT in the jails, which is still very rare. And she has figured out how to make change in her community, to take the worst experience of her life and make it into something really positive. And when people, and this is kind of where the magic sauce in the new book comes in, is when people see, just like that ED director I was talking about earlier, how he's having really good results now. When they see that happening, they like their job again. They want to do it. And they almost become evangelists for the cause. And so I'm hoping the new book will sort of like the Keaton character at the end, right? He's overcome his thing and now he's helping others.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is happening out there, but those people need to be held up, as heroes. And because they're truth tellers, they're heroes, they're doing God's work, they're really working hard, and they're just incredible. And so I'm really excited that that the show ends on that note. Of course, there's so much more work to be done, and I think the new book, Raising Lazarus, underscores that in a really stark way, while also just kind of holding up the best of humanity.
I'm excited for it to come out, and if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back.
Absolutely. This has been really fun.
For anyone listening who is either struggling themselves with opioid addiction or has a family member or a friend or knows of someone, how do you recommend someone go about treatment, seeking treatment? Do you tend to recommend any resources in general?
Yeah, it's called Partnership to End Addiction. And I would find out first if there's a harm reduction group available. The main trouble with getting people into treatment is people don't want to go. Like 40% of people with OUD, they simply don't want to get better. Now that that sounds like an awful thing, and it is an awful thing. But a lot of that is they don't want to go back to some place that treated them like crap before, right? Where they were stigmatized. And so that's why this idea of meeting people in parking lots and at needle exchanges and meeting them where they are in their homeless encampments is so important. So if it's somebody who is really on the fringe and you're trying to get them help back into systems of care, I would look for the local harm reduction organization. Now, if it's somebody who's maybe a little earlier in their addiction, I would try to find out who is doing medication-assisted treatment in that community. And so, like, there are publicly funded, some health departments do it, most do not, but that's a place to start with. Some nonprofit hospital systems are now beginning to do that. So that's another place to start with. I'm hoping that it becomes just standard that emergency departments start to do that and to bridge people into outpatient treatment for medication-assisted treatment. But that's still a very, very rare thing. So, I mean, to me, the most important thing is to remember that only 1 in 5 people actually need rehab. A lot of families will remortgage their homes to, send somebody to an out-of-state rehab. 2/3 of rehabs in America don't allow MAT. So that's exactly, you're remortgaging your home to send your loved one exactly to the kind of treatment that most likely isn't going to help them. Mm-hmm. And so, this idea of like letting people hit bottom is really something that as a culture we need to erase. Just letting people fall out of, oh, Tess will get better when she realizes we're just not going to talk to her anymore kind of thing. So we're going to send her to another state to go to rehab. And then when she bombs out of there, she's homeless again, but now she's homeless on the other side of the country with no resources at all to help her. And so now her mother says, yeah, I didn't realize that, hitting bottom, the bottom has a basement and the basement has a trap door. So that's a lesson that a lot of families have had to learn. This idea of just letting people, sort of kicking them out and letting them suffer is the way to go. That abstinence-only mindset might work for alcohol use disorder, but it doesn't really work for opioid use disorder. And that's something I think that our show portrays really well.
That was really helpful to learn.
Yeah, when you see him asking that, wait a minute, it's powerful.
Yeah.
If I could say one more thing about self-care.
That'd be great.
At the end of my book, a lot of the helpers that I was following for the new book, Raising Lazarus, are struggling themselves. They're just so overwhelmed. And, you read a lot about that with COVID, with doctors and nurses and hospitals being overwhelmed. And this concept of self-care being so important. And, some of the helpers who are people in recovery are relapsing because of the stress of helping other people. And with COVID, everything is just 10 times worse. And so for my afterword in the new book, I called this expert on trauma named Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, who has written a couple books about trauma stewardship is the name of her institute that she runs.
And secondary trauma, I believe.
Yeah. And secondary trauma and this idea of the helpers needing help. And, I've experienced some of that just reporting on it. And you worry about these people that you get close to and you spend a lot of time with. And she has a lot of really good nitty-gritty tips about how to do self-care in both of her books that I found really helpful. One is like work up a sweat every single day. Like that's a non-starter not to sweat because you've got to process what it is you're seeing. And you've got to get those endorphins out, that trauma response. It's so easy when you're down or really, really tired, exhausted, just to, pour a big old IPA or a gin and tonic or whatever. When the thing that's really going to make you feel good is to get outside in nature, take a walk or get a good sweat on. And learning mindfulness and meditation and yoga has been a huge help to me So it's just something I've learned, that if you're going to do anything adjacent to this kind of work, that it's so important to take care of your body, and that in taking care of your body, that takes care of your brain, and your emotional side.
Yes, that's so important. Thank you for sharing that. It means so much coming from you. Over the past 12 years, we have supported a variety of people and organizations who are on the front lines, helping people and their communities. And if you're listening and if Glow can be of assistance to you and your team, please reach out to us. We'll provide an email address in our show notes.
Well, that'd be great.
I guess as a final question, Beth, where can people find you online?
Sure. My Twitter is @papergirlmacy. I was the first paper girl in my little town. It's kind of a silly name, but that's what I picked 10 years ago, and I'm sticking with it. And my website is bethmacywriter.com. Some other Beth Macy writers stole bethmacy.com. But and then I'm also on Facebook at Beth Macy Author.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. You have certainly opened my eyes, my wife as well. And I look forward to seeing what you continue to create. And thank you for being such a gift to the world.
Oh, what a nice thing to say. Back at you. The classes have been just a huge part of my processing all of this. So thanks to you guys.
Well, thank you to our team at Glow. They're going to love hearing that. They love hearing how our service helps people.
It's wonderful. It really is. All right. Well, take care. Happy New Year.
You too. Happy New Year. Thank you, Beth. Thank you to our entire team behind the scenes at Glow. I'm so grateful for your care and commitment to serving our members around the world. Thank you to our teachers for so beautifully sharing your gifts and talents. I'm also grateful to our lovely community of Glow members. You've supported us since 2008, and because of you, we get to continue to do the work we love. It's the combined support of our team, our teachers, and our community that grants me the privilege to continue to bring you the Glow podcast. Thank you to Lee Schneider at Red Cub Agency for production support. And the beautiful music you're hearing now is by Carrie Rodriguez and her husband, Luke Jacobs. And remember, take care of yourself because our world needs you. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. You can find the Glow podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or glo.com/podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Derik Mills.